What is it about fear that keeps us from being where we'd like to be? Fear separates us from truth. Fear places distance between us to where we feel like we're disconnected from peace. The opposite of fear is peace. In Hebrews chapter 4, there is a sense of rest and a sense of peace that God offers and has always offered His people throughout all the ages. This lesson will be very simple. It will be very text driven. We're going to go through Hebrews chapter 4 together, circling through some things, highlighting some things. This is one of the most difficult chapters in the book of Hebrews, but it is for our rest. Hope you enjoy. So here's our text laid out before us. Let's get right to it. Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 1. Therefore, while the promise of entering notice the text, His rest still stands, let us fear. We'll underline that, come back to that. Lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. For good news came to us just as to them, but the message they heard did not benefit them because they were not united by faith with those who listened. For we who have believed enter rest. As He said, as I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Although His works were finished from the foundation of the world, for He has somewhere spoken of the seventh day in this way, God rested on the seventh day from all His works. And again, in this passage, He said, they shall not enter my rest. Let's turn the page. Since therefore it remains for some to enter it, those who formerly received the good news failed to enter because of disobedience. Again, He appoints a certain day, today, saying, through David so long afterward, in the words already quoted, today, if you hear His voice, do not harden your hearts. That's Psalm 95. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later on. So then, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever has entered God's rest has also rested, as twice in verse 10, rested from his works as God did from His. Let us therefore strive to enter that rest, so that no one may fall by the same sort of disobedience. Not only do I want to look at the word rest in this passage, but I also want to go back and let's begin in verse 1. And there's two words in this. Actually, it's used three times. So let's look at verse 1. Therefore, while the promise of entering His rest still remains, let us fear, lest any of you should seem to have failed. The word still stands here. Let's go with a different color. Still stands right here is the word remain. Not only does the promise bring rest, but the promise still remains, that it is still there. Let's go down to verse 6, next page over. Since therefore it remains, there it is, you see it, it remains for some to enter it. That means that it is not yet brought to pass, that it still remains a certain way. Look at down at verse 9. So then there it is, remains a Sabbath. Now these two words here, Sabbath and rest, are the same thing in some sense of the word, but the word Sabbath, Shabbat, in the Hebrew rather, Sabbat means not necessarily rest, but to cease, to stop. On the seventh day, God ceased from His labors, not necessarily He was exhausted and needed to just sit down. But there's three ways. Let's go to this text here and skip over to this page. Go to this text. Let's bring up blue for our notes. So, in this chapter, the word rest is used in three different ways. Rest. The first is the land of Canaan. This is Israel. Excuse me. Rael. This is Israel. This is milk and honey. And this was delivered. Let me slide that over. Well, maybe not. Milk and honey. We'll do M and H. And Joshua fulfilled this. We read it just a second ago. But the first way in which the word rest is used in this passage, this is not just the idea of ceasing from labor. This is also the sense in which that we have a pause or a place to go. The second way in which rest is used in this chapter is the day of rest. This is the Sabbath. As I said, Shabbat, as they called it. Sabbath, to cease. The holy day of old. Exodus 33, if my mind recalls. And then the third way in which the word rest is used is the ultimate rest, which is heaven. So we see this. We see the way in which that it's used in this passage. So let's go back to the text. Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 1. Therefore, while the promise of entering his rest, that's not Israel itself, that's not necessarily the church, that's not the day of rest, because it says it still stands and remains. So this would be the rest of, well, rather, let's undo that one. This is the rest, the ultimate rest, heaven. Let us fear. Go down to verse 3. For we who have believed, that's important, enter that rest, as he said, as I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Now, is this the land of Canaan? Well, no. This is what God had promised. This is what God had delivered through Joshua, because it fleshes out throughout the story. In Exodus chapter 33, as I said, this institution of this day of the holy rest actually begins in Genesis chapter 2, I believe, where that's this picture where God ceases from labor. But he says, for we, that's present tense, for we who have believed enter that rest. We go to this place, this ultimate rest, heaven. But for them, they will not enter his rest, Canaan. And they didn't. It took 40 years and a new generation of people. And it took Joshua, not Moses, to bring that about. In verse 4, it says, for he has somewhere spoken of the seventh day, so we know what we're talking about, in this way, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works. So this is a cease. And again in this passage, he said, they shall not enter my rest. That's Canaan. So go to the next page. So therefore it remains to enter, for some to enter it. Those who formerly received the good news failed to enter because of disobedience. Well, this is talking about a particular land. Okay? Again, he appoints a certain day. Today, saying through David. So you've got this picture of Joshua. You got David. And then you've got heaven itself. And then in here, in between this, is the book of Hebrews. In the book of Hebrews, he's pointing back, as I said, to Psalm 95. But this Hebrews writer is quoting David, who's talking about a land that they didn't go into, but yet the ultimate sense was heaven. So it can get a little bit complicated, so that's why we're doing it in this format, because I want us to see it and flesh it out this way. Verse 8, for if Joshua had given them rest, now pause. Joshua did. This is the land. Joshua did give them rest. God did fulfill that. He says, for if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later on. So the fact remains is that there remains a place of rest for the people of God. Now, what I want to do is look at this passage here, 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 and 10, where Peter is talking to people who are scattered abroad. They have no physical home. They've been torn apart. And he says, you are the people of God. Before, you were no people. You had no place, you had no rest, but now you are. So Israel had been given a promise of rest, and they did not believe God's promise. Thus, they did not obey God's commands. Belief always takes precedence. Belief equals obey. If you do not believe, no belief equals no obedience. No biblical obedience, that is. We'll get to that in just a minute. But they did not obey, thus they did not enter in. If we want to enter into our rest, what do we have to do? Well, we have to believe the promises of God, and we have to obey the commands of God. So that's this picture here. There was this land of rest, there was a day of rest, and there is the ultimate sense of rest, which is heaven itself. The word obey, I want to get into this. Let's separate this for just a moment. Obey. Let's talk about this word. The word obey means to submissively submit. Okay? It has to be submissively, because God is not just looking for pigeon stepping. He's not looking for obedience without the heart. So it has to be submissively. You are submissively giving yourself to the will of God. You are submitting in this way. There's something that takes place in this from this chapter in order to obey. You remember chapter 3? Let's look at that. Chapter 3, the last words in chapter 3. They did not enter because of unbelief. Now, did they not believe? Well, evidently not. In order for there to be obedience, see, it says that their bodies fail in the wilderness. Obedience must be there, but not just obedience in and of itself, but a submissive obedience. There's two things in this idea of entering rest, of obeying, and it is this. One, fear God. Two, have faith in God. And then three, follow God. When we look at the idea of fear God, if you look at verse 1, that is the word fear. Okay? Therefore, while the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us, I circled it in red earlier, let's go to fear. Let's talk about fear for just a moment. There's two ways that fear is used in our Bibles. Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 13. Let us hear the whole matter. What does it mean to fear God, to keep his commandments? We know we've been told to do that. The word fear in this case is used in respect. You have respect for God and for who he is. But the second sense of the word that the Bible uses of fear is this idea of dread, of being afraid, being terrified, being in a place where you are separated from something that you want to have, which is peace. You and I are told, biblically speaking, Jake, you need to fear. You need to fear God. You need to fear his commands. Now, do we dwell on this fear 24/7? No, that would be very unbalanced. But this idea of fear is the sense of dread. You must dread this God. You must be afraid of this God. You think about a child who does not have fear of punishment from his parents. He will not obey. Such it is, you and I are creation of God, and we have the opportunity to become the child of God. But in order for us to be adopted as sons and daughters and to become the children of God, we must not only respect, yes, but also dread, fear, be afraid. Fear. F-E-A-R. As I've said before, fear is false evidence that appears real. False evidence appears real. Now, this is a worldly fear. This is not the type of fear that we're talking about here. The type of fear that is used in this sense is they failed to reach it. Why? Because they did not fear. The good news came to them, but the message they heard, it did not benefit. You want the benefit of this message. You want the benefit of this. Now, why did it not benefit them? Because they were not united by faith. This is crucial. For we have believed, he says in verse 3. For we who have believed, we enter that rest, as he said. But if we do not fear, as the text says, if we do not respect God, keep his commandments, if we look at the example of the Israelites, the example that's given in this text, God will swear in his wrath that that's Jake, will not enter into his rest. This is the picture that's before us in Hebrews chapter 4. So you may be sitting there thinking, Jake, why is this better? Why is Jesus better? Why is chapter 4 and verse 1 tell me that I should fear and I should be in fear? And you should be afraid of God. Well, we should. Well, then what does fear have to do with rest and peace in heaven? So you and I have to fight for what we fear. If you fear man, then you'll give in to man. If you fear the ways of the world, you'll give in to those things. If you fear not being accepted by humanity or being out of place, if you're afraid of those things, then you will obey those things. We obey what we fear. As we said in this text, a child does not obey parents that they do not fear. If there's no just punishment for bad behavior, then what is there to be afraid? There's not. You and I should have a good, balanced view of God and be afraid that he is the one who is in control of my destiny, my eternal destination. But see, Jesus brings a better rest. And that's the point of this chapter, that you've got to listen to Jesus and consider Jesus, and he's better than that of Moses. You see, Joshua took those people to a place of rest, but it was not the ultimate sense of rest. See, Jesus is better than Joshua. As great of a leader and warrior as he was, Jesus is better than him. And Jesus is better than that holy day that they instituted. The place of heaven is better than the Sabbath, and it's better than the place of promise, the land of milk and honey that they had received. Jesus brings a better place, a better rest, a better heaven. And it's our prayer that you fear God, you obey God, and you follow God into his rest.